Good morning, and thank you for coming along to the CIM presentation for DSOs. I'm Stephen Gough, and I'm the DSO Technical Authority at Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, part of SSE Group. As part of this presentation, I plan to go through an overview of SSCN, highlight our digital strategy, and then get into some of the DSO elements in terms of our context and the 4 Ds of decarbonisation, decentralisation, digitalisation and democratisation of DSO. It's specifically in the final one, we're talking about our innovation project, the LEO project. Finally, I will draw this all to conclusion of how CIM relates to DSO. Here at SSEN, we operate electricity distribution and transmission networks. We're part of the distribution companies regulated by Ofgem in the UK. And to give you some context and some key facts, we have 4,000 employees across 85 depots, and that's across 7 regions. And we have about 3.8 million customers in total, including a number of, in terms of our assets, 130,000 kilometers of overhead lines and cables, as well as 106,000 substations. This includes 100 subsea cables because we've got lots of island communities in Scotland. It's also worth noting that we interact with our customers with over 500,000 calls from our customers each year. One of the key elements of our network and our company is to help support the net zero emissions target and align with targets of EVs. This particular target is a little out of date with the update just before Christmas of going completely to EVs by 2030. It's worth noting that we also have we've also facilitated the rise of renewables with 28 million gigawatts of local generation. Equally, we support the living wage and fair tax initiatives. I'm going to give you a little bit of introductory context into our digital strategy. In our digital strategy, we want to enable a broader digital ecosystem. So this is both in the energy system and our wider system. This is focusing specifically at our energy ecosystem, however. What that means essentially is that we need to expand from our network-centric view of the world to start sharing data and services with some of our key customers. This is facilitated by a marketplace. This is through flexibility markets, but also markets and data. That is key. Equally, that means that we're starting to build in some of the key areas of work on our future networks portfolio. This is quite important because it allows us to operate our network in a more forward-looking way. And that's all underpinned through innovation and the publishing of our data through open data initiatives. It's worth noting that this is both open, shared, and bilateral sharing of data depending on the context and the security risks. But it means it's quite a significant shift to be a more open organisation implementing the open by default initiatives, which are being recommended by the Energy Data Task Force. Getting back to our customers and stakeholders, we've done customer segmentation work to try and understand the needs and requirements of our customers. And this is split between our core customers, our domestics, our vulnerable customers, our large energy users, our aggregators, customers who will need to enable flexibility. Our partners and peers, these are people who we work with, our supply chain, people we innovate with. Our EV and low carbon technology supply chain. This is an area where there's significant ramping up of services required. So we are going to require many more interactions with these types of customers and the end customers who will be supplying these. And then finally, the industry. So that's our planning partners, other DSOs, transmission colleagues, the regulator policymakers, our gas network colleagues. These are people who we're going to be doing joint planning, people we're going to be working as an industry to make things better, where we need to interact. One of our other key planning partners are local authorities, help us make sure we are planning in conjunction and tandem. Through the implementation of our strategy, we have got a couple of different streams in our implementation. First of all, we need to create our foundations, making sure we've got our data, making sure that we understand the obligations which are required to us and how we can facilitate the transformation, both from a decarbonisation of heat, transport, and ensuring that we hit our net zero targets. This is equally ensuring that we can transition in terms of our digital implementation and making sure no one's left behind. Then we've obviously got our requirements and obligations for open data, making sure we're sharing data. We've got our metadata published, ensuring that all that information is shared within our wider digital ecosystem. And finally, we've got enabling our future for whole system and competition. So that's how we collaborate and compete in the relevant arenas with the data which we're publishing and with our services which we're going to be enabling. This is translated into our 4 implementation pillars, which are essentially customer and ecosystem, where we're going to be using our new services and creating those capabilities, our externally facing elements, our platforms, which are our back-end systems, how we facilitate our systems, how we get our data set up, and ensuring that we're implementing CIM. And insight in automation, that's where we're taking that data and information which we're creating, add automation to drive value, and starting overlaying data analytics capability and AI with machine learning to drive some more value and insight. And then finally, organizational alignment, where we look at our organization, look to implement agile teams, look at a more lean perspective and making sure that we're implementing data culture and appropriate data governance across our organization to actually facilitate this. One of the key elements in terms of CIM is our platform area. That's fundamentally how we're going to translate our data between our internal systems and facilitate the sharing of data out to our external customers. This is pretty critical because without CIM to underpin this process, we have a whole lot of disparate data sets which you can't overlay contextual information. So our architecture to facilitate this fundamentally is through taking our core systems, which are largely legacy, but then overlaying through our data pipelines to our common network model. That allows us to facilitate our digital channels out to our customers. And that's where we can take that information in a meaningful way with the appropriate data catalog underpinning by CIM and the appropriate standards. Then equally, that same set of data cut in the appropriate way is used for our analytics. It's worth noting that in this presentation I won't be going into the technical detail of how we're going to be deploying CIM because my colleague Neil Meredith is presenting in a couple of presentations time to go through the technical detail. I'm going to be focusing on the business context, which takes us onto the context for DSO. It's worth noting that I'm using the role of DSO here, referring to the enablement of markets and flexibility. We in the UK, our core function is a DNO, a distribution network operator. We look after our assets and we look after how we traditionally use our network. However, we're starting to move into a different role, but our trilemma still exists of being affordable, sustainable and reliable. It's worth noting that that equally has to be safe as an overlay of all of that. it's worth noting that we're clearly going to have to address significant step change in the coming years as we hit our challenges of net zero. Which takes us neatly onto the 4 Ds of DSO, which are decarbonisation, decentralisation, digitalisation, and democratisation. That fundamentally allows us to be a distribution system operator. So what does this actually mean in context? So decarbonisation is our transition to net zero. Decarbonisation of heat, decarbonisation of transport, and all the infrastructure and implications that draws. Not to mention, obviously, more and more renewable generation, which is going to have a much larger proportion along our distribution networks. Which takes us neatly onto decentralisation. We're going to have those smaller generators embedded in our networks. That means that we're going to have more variable energy flows throughout our network. And to overlay this, we've got more flexible demand and demand which is controllable across our networks too. We need appropriate coordination of that demand and generation to ensure that that works effectively. Digitalization is where we are overlaying the technical capabilities to link to all those assets to make sure that we understand what's going on in our network and how we control and influence that demand in an effective way. Essentially, the how we start facilitating this in a more appropriate way. But that only makes sense once we've got the democratization aspect of it. We need to enable this through markets, understand the impact it has across the wider customers and industry, to ensure that we facilitate this appropriately across all our customers and that no one's left behind, and that the appropriate investment decisions and flexibility market decisions are made at any given time, and ensure that we remain neutral throughout all. It's worth highlighting that Ofgem have highlighted our key requirements for DSO as well, and drawing your attention specifically to data management and sharing and the coordination between TNT interfaces. They, in particular, as new capabilities, require appropriate running of CIM. Without it, we don't have any structured data which we can share across the entire industry in an appropriate and easy and facilitated way. Getting onto our 4Ds in a little bit more detail. Decarbonisation. It's quite obvious that we're going through a massive amount of change. A step change when we're talking about EVs, and a step change when we're talking about heating. Moving away from gas and seeing all that demand come onto our electricity networks, with some of it going onto hydrogen, obviously. But that obviously has a load profile of itself. Equally with transportation, that's going to be a massive driver in recent years, particularly with a target of 2030 to ban all sales of internal combustion cars in the UK. It allows us to look at the load of our network. It's without the good thing about both demand and heat demand and transportation demand is that they're relatively flexible and controllable. That means that we can share and shift the load across our different parts of our network, which is excellent. It basically means that we can help shape that demand curve in a more effective way. But that means moving away from our typical way of considering our demand as a single point in time, but looking at a profile, which is a significant shift in the way we do things. So in terms of the relevant CIM standards, we use for a representation of our network IEC 61970, which focuses on our network models. This is important to be able to have our network model represented in a CIM compliant way. What's important when we're implementing our network model, so it's a representation of our network connectivity model. This fundamentally underpins our common network model, which is our central repository of data. This is done through GE Electric Office. And what it allows us to do is overlay low carbon technologies to make sure we understand their behavior. And equally, it means we can effectively manage our load and our generation and overlay that information and the locations of our customers and how they relate to our network in one central coordinated place. Fundamentally, our network connectivity model is the core framework which we overlay other data sets onto it, and that means we build up something which is getting closer to our digital twin, which is fundamentally the structure which we've created in the common network model. With decentralization, it's important that we consider the impact across our broader network. It's worth noting here that we've got our energy-centric view. We're moving away from peak power, looking at the profiles of our network. We're looking at unidirectional energy flows, but it's going to be predictable. But when we move into customer-centric, that's going to be moving away from that. We're going to have more flexibility requirements. We're going to be shifting our demand and generation, and there's going to be more unpredictable. This equally means that we need to overlay the markets and how we can actually facilitate this through our ability of costing and using flexibility services to do this. It's worth noting that that means that we need to start optimizing our grid in both energy, but equally in terms of time domain as well. It's worth noting that this is where CIM IEC 62325, the market management and market operations standard, is going to be really important, but it's very immature in the UK in terms of its implementation. That hasn't been tried at all. So it's one of the areas where we want to really investigate this implementation in a bit more detail and depth. To give you an analogy in terms of how we run our network and DSO in terms of our shift from being a DNO to a DSO, if we consider our road network, it's a motorway essentially. If you were taking a road analogy, some of our key parts of our network moving up and down. We're getting to the stage where we're getting congestion, we're getting traffic jams coming up. So next, what we need to do to try and facilitate that, we do network investment. It's the traditional way of doing it. We build more roads. But obviously, there's other options rather than just building more roads. The other way of doing it is by using active management. So this is where we use flexible speed limits, opening and closing our hard shoulders, allowing us to manage the flow of the traffic actively and depending on what time of day it is. The other element, of course, is to consider more active solutions as well. So this is smart solutions, looking at time of day, look at shared use, being able to change where your central reservation is and using real-time inputs to develop that. Then finally, you overlay price signals. That's essentially your toll roads. You can obviously vary those toll roads depending time of day and depending on the time of year as well. So that obviously has an impact. Equally, you can make it free on certain times when it's particularly low to help facilitate use of that road. So that essentially gives us a basic analogy of what we can do in DSO and use flexibility to help facilitate more effective and efficient use of our electricity network. Digitalization is where we start to utilize some of the technology to help facilitate this vision. In the UK, a lot of our view on digitalization is actually driven from the Energy Data Task Force. They had a set of recommendations, which are numbered as 1 to 5, essentially on this slide. But what it means is the presumed open in terms of open data. So in terms of actually making this happen, we need to make sure that we have filled in the gaps in terms of our data, making sure that people have what they need. But equally, we need to maximize our value from that data. And a way that's facilitated through a set of principles. Those broad principles of digitalization of our energy system, and that our network is presumed open. So that means we're sharing data as a default. So what this means in terms of our digitalization is that we need to identify new data needs. We need to have continuous improvement and continually update our digitalization strategies. From a presumed open perspective, we may make sure that our data is discoverable, searchable, understandable, and that we have structure and interface and standards. Specifically, that's where CIM comes in to facilitate this. Not to mention, obviously, that it's secure and resilient as well. That essentially allows us to create the building blocks, which again are very relevant to CIM. A data catalog. That data catalog needs to be industry relevant. It has to be consistent across everyone who's implementing it. Again, using a standard to facilitate that is critically important. Equally, when we're talking about our assets, we need to be recording all the same information in that registration process and making sure our strategy aligns with that. Again, using CIM to make sure that the information we're recording on CIM is incredibly important. And those both get brought together in terms of representing that information in a digital system map. That's where we represent our data in a geospatial way with lots of overlays of contextual information. Again, if we're going to be sharing that as an industry, well, our data sets need to be consistent and relevant, not to mention aligned with our other contextual data sets. Again, having data standards to facilitate that. Fundamentally, a lot of what we're going to be discussing in CIM is important. So, from a basic perspective, we've got our network connectivity model. This is basically a full impedance model of our network down to our LV, and importantly, where our customers are connected at any given time. This gives us the fundamental base of us to build a broader digital twin. We obviously got broader information in terms of the load, the energy, the markets, the maintenance, the work planning, which is all anchored to this network connectivity model. A good example in terms of where we are at the moment is the tree. We understand the branches in the trunk in terms of our key asset information down to our HV networks, but we get to the LV when we get to those little twigs at the end and the leaves where we've got our customers, and we don't have that yet. We essentially need to grow those leaves as we're coming out from essentially winter into spring and summer to build up our network. So we've got the view of all those customers, but obviously the complexity increases. To do that effectively, we need to make sure any solutions are scalable. And that's where we need to start implementing rigorous processes and standards across our data to do that effectively. So this takes us on to the final element, which is our democratization of data. And using the LEO project as our key area of here. So LEO project is an innovation project looking at community, technology and markets. It's worth noting that the LEO project is actually a project of two halves. We've got the transition project, which is a network innovation competition project. And then we've got an Innovate UK funded LEO project, which is looking at the customer elements. Transition is looking at the back end. So actually is the more relevant bit for our networks. But when you're talking about our customer and markets, the LEO project is the more relevant element. It's based in Oxfordshire, and we're looking to facilitate markets down to lower customer levels on the LV networks and above to make sure that we understand the practicalities of deploying DSO. Fundamentally, it means that we can test run flexibility services in a full-scaled perspective to understand some of the technology requirements and the market rules to allow us to do that. In terms of what that actually means, we've got key elements within our network. We've got our data platforms, which are spread between the DNO, the TO, the ESO, the supplier, the local energy provider, and the council. And we investigate in that area what those data platforms need to be and what the data structures will be. Equally, we've got our core systems within transition, which are in the blue. From there, we're looking at forecasting, our power system analysis, our analytics, our contract management, our scheduling, activation dispatch, and the settlement management. That's facilitated through essentially the creation of two functional entities of a whole system coordinator and a market facilitation. These two new entities is looking at how we make the decisions of the most appropriate processes for flexibility in the whole system coordinator, and the platform which allows the market to be settled and implemented through the market facilitation. So these are things that have been created as part of transition. Equally, through the market elements of it of Leo, we've then got the customer. How do we share information between our key customers? How do we use our technology platforms to be able to give value out to those customers so they can make appropriate decisions? And how do we interface with all those different customers? It's worth noting that within the whole market coordinator and market facilitation is where we start using some of the IEC standards in a little bit more detail. For the market facilitation element of it, we need to trial IEC 62325. That basically allows us to understand how we do markets more appropriately. And then to really get to grips with the whole system coordination, we need to have a good view of our market model. And that's where we'll use CIM standard IEC 61970 in a little bit more detail to understand how we represent that model, because we're doing close to real-time load flows to make the appropriate decision making. So keeping that up to date and in step with the rest of our network is really important. So finally, we're talking about what that means in reality for CIM. It's worth noting here that I've split the facilitation of CIM into two perspectives: the sharing of our data, externally focused, and the integration, our internally focused. And when I'm talking about transition, I'm talking about our net zero transition, talking about our DSO transition, talking about our digitalization transition. We've got a lot of change afoot. It's worth noting that when we're considering this, we've got to think about what impact it has. So for the sharing of data, our externally focused, we need to align across our industry. We need to think about how we can implement our energy data, and that's been done through the Energy Data Working Group at the ENA. We've got basically an energy systems map which has been brought together. That's been complemented by the National Underground Assets Register as well. Equally, we've got the facilitation of open data. So CIM is fundamentally underpinning the MEDA work which is going on, which is the modernising energy data work and the energy data access work. We've got industrial collaborations as well, such as Flexa, which is again underpinned by CIM. Then we've obviously got the creation of our data catalogues, which are national. So we've got that going through BAYS, but equally the implementation of a new BSI CIM standard for gas. From an internal perspective, fundamentally underpins our system integration. We need to create our common network map. We have to support easier data analytics and facilitate our IT upgrade program, which is needing to happen. Without CIM, none of these things are easy in terms of our data migration. Equally, we need to do our data governance, and that's only done appropriately with CIM. Because we need to facilitate data quality metrics and being able to set up KPIs. If we don't have a data catalog to pull that across, facilitating those elements is very, very tricky. And then finally, we need to drive value internally. If we've got data which is readily accessible in a understood format, which we can draw data together, we can get rapid insights. And specifically as well, if we've got that data which is across all our systems in a joined up way, we can enable far more energy, far more efficiency in terms of our business process. So finally, when we pull this all together, we have our implementation for CIM, where we're using our markets, our asset management, customers and operations, and the network model together to create our common network model. All right, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video insightful and enjoyable. We post new smart grid related videos every Friday at 12 CET, so please go ahead and subscribe and let colleagues in other departments and peers in other organisations know so that they can benefit too. We welcome your feedback, so if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them below. Thanks again and have a great day.